Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free, where we talk to people who have lived self-actualized lives on their own terms and find out how they got there, what they do, how we can get there, what we can learn from them, how to live our best lives, find our own definition of success, and most importantly, find joy. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times best-selling author of The Horse Boy, founder of New Trails Learning Systems and LongRideHome.com. You can find details of all our programs and shows on rupertisaacson.com. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free, where we talk to people who live self-actualized lives and find out how they did it and how they still do it and what can we learn from them. What's the true meaning of success? What's the true meaning of fulfillment? Is it money? Is it career? Is it how you feel inside? Is it your creativity? Is it all of the above? Is it none of the above? What does it mean to you? So we have the amazing, by any standards, Jane Pike with us tonight, who is jolly interesting. Why is Jane Pike jolly interesting? Well, Jane Pike was an early pioneer of the online membership, equestrian, learn to train your horse or learn to ride better type stuff that came out a few years ago on the internet. And many, many, many people have done this. I myself have signed up for quite a few of these things because, hey, it's always good to learn something. And I know some people who certainly made money at it. I don't know many people who have managed to both be economically successful at it and also genuinely help people out and also do it from a perspective that is neurological, showing people how to really access what's in their bodies, the sort of wisdom of the nervous system in a way that goes far transcends horses. She's also a poet, but she don't know it, but you will soon know it because there'll be something published quite soon. And she's sort of all round awesome. And she very definitely lives life on her own terms down there on the South Island of New Zealand, where she's not traveling all over the world. And so I feel that we could tap into some Jane Pike wisdom about how do you do something like this? How do you become financially, creatively independent like this and live in this extraordinary place and help people out all over the world and still sort of remain cool. So, without further ado, welcome Jane Pike.
Thank you. That was the loveliest introduction I've ever had. And the stay cool bit is questionable, but we'll see how we roll.
It's nothing but the truth. And there are many people who'll be listening right now who are followers of Jane Pike. Jane Pike has a website called confidentrider.com. And
online.
.online. Sorry, good Lord.
No, that's all right. By the early pioneers, and we'll just buy all the domain names. Yeah.
Online. I'll say it three times because what I said three times is true. Confidentrider.online, confidentrider.online, confidentrider.online. And her Joyride program has thousands of people around the world. And I'm always running into people who go, I'm a Jane Pike fan girl. So let's find out why they are. So Jane Pike, who are you?
Who am I? In what sense? In what sense shall we begin the who are you conversation?
Well, you could begin it in the physical sense, as in, I am this person who lives here and does this. You could begin it in the esoteric sense of, I was once this person who lived there and did that, but then returned to source and came back as a flea and then went through my reincarnation cycle. Or you could just tell us who you are.
Yeah, well, I am Jane. I'm Jane. Thank you for having me here. At the moment, I live in a little corner of the South Island of New Zealand, and I wasn't born here originally. I was born in Australia, but my travels took me to New Zealand when I was in my late teens, actually, which is kind of a funny story because one of my best friends from school, Claire, we wanted to travel after we'd done a period of study, and we wanted to go to Asia, and we went to the travel agent and said, this is where we want to go. And they were like, oh, well, that's holiday time. It's all booked out. And she said, but what about New Zealand? And both of us went, oh, New Zealand. Why would we want to go there? It's just like Australia. That was kind of thought at the time in our ignorant Australian mindset. But then because we both wanted to get out of the country, we were like, oh, okay, let's go. And so we hired a little car and drove around the South Island of New Zealand for 2 weeks. And I instantly fell in love with it. And then we decided at that point that after the next semester of university that we would come back and do a longer stint over the summer. And Claire pulled out on that longer stint and I decided to come by myself. And then I just didn't go home, basically. So that
This
was
was in
my
your late
foray into
teens. And now
Yeah.
you at this point, we're fast forwarding to your current career. So you've got this hyper successful online business doing equestrianism and the nervous system, the human nervous system. I presume you weren't doing that in your late teens, but
No.
what was the groundwork? What were you doing then that led to now?
Oh my goodness. That's like a lot of territory to cover.
That's why
I think
we're doing this
late,
podcast.
when I think about it, late teens is probably an inaccurate. It would have been very early 20s. I'm time morphing now in my mind. But what led to it? A period of massive indecision and not knowing what to do with my life for like 10 years probably. But my start point was I was very academic at school, and I was one of those people that had a very clear idea of what I was going to do with my life. I was like, right, I'm going to tick all of these boxes and I'm going to come out of school. And I got a scholarship to Sydney University for communications law. And I knew that at that point I had to get a specific
Kylie Minogue's lawyer.
It's to get a specific score at school. And so my whole life literally was oriented around study and getting this score that I needed to get into the course that I wanted. And they were very selective. It was like at that stage, the way that the school system worked, you took your best 5 subjects out of like a series of subjects that you were doing. And each of those subjects had a score out of 20. And I had to get over 96 out of 100 overall to get the scholarship. And so that's what happened. And so I got into this degree, this double degree. And I went from a little town in rural Tasmania at that point to the centre of Sydney. And I had like an apartment, and
What could go wrong?
it was like a complete shock to the nervous system. And I just remember sitting there a few weeks in thinking, what am I doing here? I was kind of like desperately homesick. And I also had this very clear, I don't know if you'd call it vision, but just sense of what the end of that particular period of study would most probably look like, which is me sitting in an office, sorting through paperwork, climbing my way up this chain of like whatever it is I need to climb up to get to whatever position that I wanted to be. And I just thought, this is just not going to make me happy. I was like, this is not going to make me happy.
How long did it take you to come to that realization?
About 4 weeks. And so I remember pleading with my parents.
Process. That's good.
Yeah, I remember pleading with my parents and being like, I just want to come home. And they were like, you stay till the end of this, period, get it sorted, go and see the counsellor. We think you're just homesick and all of these things. And in the end, I had like a little Mitsubishi Colt, which was like a little red smarty car that was probably questionably roadworthy. And I just packed it up to the ceiling and drove 3 states across Australia. And that was the end of that particular moment in my life, and also the end of clarity for what I was going to do. And then it just became like a hodgepodge for the next sort of decade.
Looking at you now, you've got nervous system expertise, which we're going to dive into, because if you're listening, you do want to know some of the things that Jane knows about your nervous system. They are useful. Mm-hmm. And horses. So where did the horses come in?
So my mum is a passionate horsewoman, and I had horses from the moment that I was born. She had horses. And I think it was a huge convenience that I happened to be interested in what she was into, because I think if I hadn't been, I think I just would have had no option, basically. So it was just kind of handy. And she had a horse called Icon, who was a Arab cross something that was, she had him since he was a 2-year-old, and he actually only relatively recently passed away in his 40s. So she had him literally his whole life. And she used to ride all of the time, and I've got photos of me plonked up on Icon from a very early age. And then when I was about 5, my dad said to me, "Come with me. You're going to come. We're going to go for a walk." And the area that we lived, there was a road that led up to like the end of a bush track or a clearing, and Mum rode this pony from a friend's house that incidentally she had got him from through the clearing, and that was Captain, who was my pony basically. And he was rescued out of a bramble bush on the side of the road in kind of slightly dilapidated state and had been brought back to health. And now I had this like black, wild maned, unidentified breeding pony that was mine. And we were very fortunate at the time that the area that we were in was surrounded by farmland. And the farmer also bred riding ponies on the side. And so he was horse friendly and let us ride over all his paddocks, which was sort of about 500 acres and very like massive, hills and bush and rivers and all those sorts of things. So I just used to take off on Captain and like ride around the paddocks. And what was really glorious about it looking back was my lack of just self-consciousness about that experience, because he was like a very wild looking pony, but I used to take him in all the competitions with all the fancy ponies that were all platted up. And I had no clue that I was like completely inappropriate for that setting. I'd just be like cantering around and both of our hair would be going all over the place. And I just didn't have the gear. I was the opposite of all the gear and no idea. I was like no gear and no idea. But it was pretty fun, yeah. And Mum used to come riding as well with
Did
me,
at some
obviously.
point the gear and the ideas come together? So did you and Mum sort of get the showing thing together and then end up sort of killing it in the shows at a certain point? And
Yeah,
if so,
my
how?
sister
How'd that happen?
My sister as well. Well, I don't know. I think that it really is this unclear in my mind about what made that decision come for my mum and dad. But they were both competitive runners. And so that's how they met. My mum was one of the first was the first woman to run competitively in Australia. She came over on like the $2 ticket from the UK. And there were no races for women at that point. So she started running with the men and she beat them. And they were very put out about that, which created some women's races in Australia. And so she was running the 5,000 and 10,000 meters. And my dad was a sprinter. And so they met and hit it off, obviously. And I think that why I mentioned that was because they had like a competitive streak in them that maybe when I was flying around with like mane flying in the wind and they saw these other people and they saw how into it I was, they thought maybe there would be a possibility for me to take it a little bit further. And so, or maybe they just couldn't stand it and they wanted to do better. And so they bought me a pony called Minnie, who was a riding pony, and she was amazing actually. And I just remember being shocked because I went from like this little bush pony to like this quite fancy little other pony who had lots of issues at the time. It's so funny retrospectively looking back where, like she was very cold backed and had issues that I would now treat from a variety of perspectives, like bodywork.
For those
and things
who are not horsey, cold back means you're likely to get bucked off when you.
Yeah, so I used to like leap on, and then there would be like a moment where you'd go around the arena like 2 or 3 times, and that was just standard. Like, and my parents never used to think anything of it, which is so weird because if I put my child on a pony like that, they wouldn't. But it was just like, oh yeah, she's fine. You just need to sort of get through that first part. So that's what we did. And she progressively got better and better. She was quite young when I got her. And so we had quite a successful showing career together. And I had sort of lots of other horses in between that were part of what I just did my whole life. I just used to get up before school and ride, and I rode after school, and I mucked out stables and did the whole works. And that was my life pretty much. Yeah.
So you're in an obsessive, perfectionist, competitive horsey family. You are out there showing, and
that's a strong label, Rupert. It's a strong
well.
label.
And then you decide to go off to university to become Kylie Minogue's lawyer. Decide that might be.
Well, I actually wanted to be a journalist. That was my true passion, but they offered like a double degree. And so it was like, oh, well, why not? Like that was just my thought. Why not? Yeah.
Then 4 weeks into that, out of Tasmania, you decide, no, this is awful. I need to get back home. And then you say that was the end of clarity. So knowing you now, you seem pretty clear. I see you mentoring people on how to run businesses. I see you mentoring people on how to do online stuff. I see you mentoring people on how to get their nervous systems together and so on. So if you say that non-clarity hit you, how long did it hit you for? And where did it lead you?
20 years.
Okay, that's good. That's a good minimum sort
No,
of.
not quite that long, but I'm joking, but I'm not joking.
When you get to my age, 20 years, it's sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, only 20 years? Yeah.
It's like clarity is an interesting word, isn't it? Because I'd been trained into an expectation of what I should do when I left school, and a smart person who does well at school, this is sort of the labels that I did well at school because I was so afraid of not doing well. From the point of like letting people down or getting in, it wasn't motivated from a place of like, wow, learning's amazing. Let's like make the most of this. It was like, if I don't do this, I'm going to disappoint someone. And if I don't want to disappoint someone, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't know that
that's
I
a lot
learned
of us, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that I learned as much as I really was good at playing the game. I'm like, okay, I know what you need for this exam, and I will learn exactly what you need. I will predict the questions. And when I get there, I will spew out everything I know, and that will get me a perfect score, which is true. Like I was smart in that I could decipher what was required of me, and I could predict it, and I gave it to them. It's different from learning, because now I couldn't necessarily think back to what it is that I learned and tell you with passion. I just knew that in this particular area of study, like history or English, or that this is probably the question that they're going to ask me based on what we've studied, or one of these. And so literally, if I write the essay beforehand and I memorize it, I can change the introduction and I can change the conclusion around the question, and I will just give you what you want to hear. And that's what I did. And so I think that brought me success at school. And so when I stepped outside of that, and all of a sudden the framework that was comfortable to me, which was, here are my friends, here is this institution, here is this place that I know what the rules are. And I notice, the wider world. I notice it actually for the first time, like, well, shit, this is actually my life. This isn't like getting to the next stage of like 17 or 18. This is like where I'm supposed to sit when I'm 40 or 50 or 60 or 70. Like, and is that what I want? I think I've always had that little spark in me thinking about that. And it rebelled at that moment. And then it threw me into a huge amount of confusion, because I became somewhat of the joke. And this was a bit of an ego bruise, because I was the person that if my friends were like, oh, who's going to make it or who's going to do the thing, they'd be like, oh, Jane will do it. Like she'll do it. And then all of a sudden I was the one flunking out of university, and I was the one trying a million different things and going to these crazy places. And it became a thing of like, oh, Jane's doing another thing, or Jane's like, oh, Jane's doing this now. And it was very challenging for me to take. I'm sure in some ways they meant it lovingly and that, or they didn't mean anything by it. But for me, who had created a lot of my identity, I think, and value around academic success, it was a lot. Like I really was wobbling inside with that, and did wobble for the next sort of 10 years, even though retrospectively I did a lot of stuff which people would think was very cool. And I think on reflection, I can see how it was. I know at the time I probably didn't get the most out of it, because I just really struggled with who I was at that point and where it was going.
So talk us through these wilderness years. We know that at a certain point you had a look at New Zealand and have ended up there, but there's more. So you come back from Tasmania. You're thinking, oh God, what do I do?
Yeah.
My identity's been wrong. What happens? Where do you go?
Yeah. I just rack up some student debt, like trying lots of different things that I never finish, and have some kind of like financial obligation to, which was, as an adult, I wouldn't do that. But at the time, it just didn't really occur to me. It didn't really occur to me that was going to be a thing. And I did study health science and got into sort of naturopathy and herbal medicine as part of that, which was the beginnings, I think, of leading to where it is that I am now.
What
But
led you from being a journalist and wanting to be huge accident, Kylie Minogue's lawyer, to herbs and herbology?
I
Had you
yeah, I
always had
don't
a bit
know.
of a yen that way? Or
I think so. I think so. And there was a few kind of key incidents in here, which now, again, retrospectively, I see that have fed into what it is that I'm doing now. So one of the big life changers at that point was that my parents moved from where we'd always lived for my like duration of sort of 10 to 19 to Victoria, which is on mainland Australia. So we'd lived in Tasmania up until that point. And I moved over as well. I lived on a different property to them with my horses and just had a really, really hard time with like isolation and kind of venturing out into the adult world in a way that perhaps wasn't the most ideal transition, in that I moved to somewhere where I didn't know anyone, where I was very isolated with the horses. My parents were coming 6 months later, so my family wasn't there yet. And it was just like this, I think health-wise, that really started to knock me around. And again, looking back, I don't know why that was a supported decision. But again, it's just a different time, isn't it, when you just do different things than what it is you do for your own kids now. But the reason that this is relevant is because at that stage, I was really suffering health-wise. I had like a lot of different back issues, which I'd had my entire teens, like to the point where my back would just burn and I couldn't escape the pain that I was feeling in my back. And I had a lot of anxiety. That was definitely a feature. I would say I was a very imbalanced human at that moment in time for a few different reasons that fed in. And so I started to seek out different solutions to my own wellness. And at one point, one of those solutions was I went to a fair, like a wellness fair, and saw a chiropractor there who like got out all of the machines and like read the amount of tension that was in my system and put me on like this prescription of like ridiculous amounts of sessions with him. And he popped a disc in my back with his adjustment. And so, yeah, so then I became even more incapacitated with my own stuff at that point. And so that led me, like I said, into being interested in different alternative therapies. And I was quite stoic at that point in time, and I didn't want to take, I really know why, but I didn't want to take traditional pain medication or painkillers. And so I think, well, when I say I don't know why, like I had seen people in my family, struggle with different medications for different reasons. And I guess that part of me was like very much not wanting to be in that same ilk. So that led me on the health science route, and then that led me further down wanting to study yoga at a different period of time and breath work and all of these things. And that was definitely a huge part of the next sort of 10 years that followed after that.
So you just said yoga and breath work and wellness. So, okay, you're looking for solutions for your back.
Yeah.
You're there in Victoria wondering what to do. You've got the family horses, is that right? On a family property, but you're supposed to kind of look after people. You don't know anybody. And now you've got a bad back, which isn't helpful, of course, if you're going to work with horses. And it's young to have a bad back. So what do you find, and how does that lead you to yoga and breathwork? And where does yoga and breathwork lead you?
So there's so many odd transitions in this part of the story. This is like, if you looked at like a ball of wool at this point, this is like the bit where it's all like tangled in together and there's lots of different moving parts. Yoga and breathwork. So I decided at some point that I needed to do something a little bit different to what it was that I was doing. And I really had got myself into a bit of a bad place mentally and physically at that point in time. And the transition came where I had horses that were, that were either very young or that were able to be sort of semi-retired by that stage. So I had no kind of middle ground horses at that moment. And so what that meant is that my horses could go onto my parents' property and essentially they could look after them without it being a really big deal because they had quite a lot of land at that point in time. And so there was an opening, I guess, for me to do something different because that at that point, my commitment to my animals would have probably stopped me doing other things, but it just so happened that that was possible at that moment. And that was where I decided to go to New Zealand. And
With your
in New
backpack?
Zealand, yeah, well, my back was kind of like workable at that point, but it was sort of like just permanently not okay. So they thought I had rheumatoid arthritis. They thought I had like loads of different things that were going on because it was sort of unusual to have the degree of what I had at the age that I was, like you said. And so I went to New Zealand, and the second stage of that, which is when I sort of jumped ship and moved over there for the summer, I met an Israeli and ended up going back to Israel with him.
Like you do.
Like I do. Yeah. Yeah. And that was after living in New Zealand for a period of time and starting to wibble wobble around. And at that stage, I was in Tel Aviv and there was a gym across the road. And the gym was the best place that I started to learn Hebrew because I was doing this horrendous spin class. And they'd be like, lamala, lamata, lamala, lamata, which is like up, down, up, down. And so I started to learn, all my Hebrew was coming from like the things that the gym people were shouting at me in classes to do. And so I was just like on a mission, basically. I had this like window where I wasn't working necessarily. I was living off savings, and I decided to just get well. And as one of those classes was a yoga class. And I went into the yoga class, and I, in my competitive mindset, was like, I'm really bad at yoga, which is like what a lot of people say. And it was just because I was like, had the flexibility of a concrete truck and just kind of found everything quite challenging. But I kept going, and I thought, oh, maybe this is going to be able to help me in some way. And that really was kind of the catalyst for seeking out physical therapies that would allow me to find ease, basically, to just not be in pain. And alongside of that, again, I find this really difficult to explain because I can't make sense of it. A lot of these transitions myself, it's all kind of like bound together. But I think that there'd always been a part of me that was a seeker, and there'd always been a part of me that was interested in, spirituality and wellness. And that was motivated by like another parallel thread in my life where, someone in my family was incredibly unwell for the duration of my life in mental health wise. And I just remember thinking that to be out of control of my own mind was like the worst fate that I can imagine befalling someone.
You were exposed to that as a kid. You saw
Yes. Yeah.
mental illness within the family.
Yes.
And had to deal.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that kind of also informed a lot of what I talked about earlier as far as like, just wanting to not rock the boat and to be the good girl and to tick the boxes, because that just meant I could keep things as stable as possible, and probably was an element of control in my own life.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of the pain came from.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of listeners, they might be like, well, hold on, she's lives in this lovely spot, and then she's got these horses, and but one of the things which we all know is that these things can mask other things under the surface. And so if you were indeed dealing with mental illness in a sort of in your face kind of a way, then yes, indeed, no matter how many on the surface nice things are going on, there's an underlying insecurity. And as a child, that is difficult because it's your security. So do you feel that the seeds of you as a seeker of human wellness, I feel this is such an overused term, but I can't think of a better one at this particular point. Human okayness, really. Human the healing that brings us to that started actually quite early in your life. Do you feel that was really
accurate? Yeah, very, very early. And there are 3 strands to that aren't necessarily altruistic in the first instance, although they have hopefully become more so that. The first is to want to save someone that you love, right? So that was one of my initial motivations. And after I absconded from the, the journalist and the law degree, I thought, well, maybe I'll be a psychiatrist, or maybe I'll be a psychologist, because that, or a researcher that could study like the ways that the brain works, and so that I could stop, will help, this person, and also stop it happening from other people. And then the second thread of that was, what if that's my destiny, right? Like, what if there's nothing I can do? What if this is my lot? What if this is what I'm going to become? And so that was the second thread of that. And then the third thread was, I used to get quite nervous as a competitor, and I did love riding. And so the psychology of like positive thinking and being able to control yourself mentally and emotionally was always really interesting to me. Like, ever since I can remember, my bedside table was like stacked with books about that. That was what I read.
Did you find those books yourself, or did your friends?
I did find those books myself. Yeah, my mum had one. Oh, I can see the cover of it. That Winning Feeling by, she just recently passed away. Her name's just gone out of my head, and she was such a.
I'm going to look it up on my phone.
Yes, but that was, my mum had that like very dog-eared book, and so that kind of sparked my.
Was that a helpful book? Would you say?
Yeah, at the time, I think it was well ahead of its time. Now we see it as part of perhaps more the pop psychology, positive thinking.
Jane Savoy, that Winning Feeling.
Jane Savoy, yeah. I mean, because we're so fortunate these days to be exposed to so much more because of the internet, I think that a lot of what she mentions in there would perhaps we'd see as part of the mainstream movement within, like, affirmations and positive thinking and visualization and that sort of thing. But at the time, that was pretty revolutionary, especially in the horse world. And so I used to have that as my Bible. And
did you used to do affirmations when you were?
Yeah, I did. Like,
going into shows and such.
Yeah,
did it help?
Yeah. Kind of hurt. I did okay.
Did you feel a shift? Did you feel in your chest, sort of thing?
I think that I always had that underlying dis-ease within myself, but it helped me hold it together. And then there were moments where, it's kind of a funny juxtaposition and parallel that, like, in some ways the lead up was always the worst. So that transition coming into it. But as soon as I got on my horse, I did feel like I could conquer the world. Okay. So, and not from a like, I'm going to steamroll you type way, but just like, I just felt so at home riding and doing what I did. And I was so proud of my horse and loved my horse so much that that was kind of all I needed to get out there.
Did you, where you at the time were less successful, for example, when you made the transition to university and then found it wasn't for you, and then you became the sort of, Jane Pike trying this, Jane Pike trying that, people ribbing you about that in your community. Were you also at that point trying affirmations in those areas of your life and then finding it wasn't working? Or did you sort of let it go and come adrift? Did you really only use the affirmations and that sort of thing in your competitive life?
There was always a sense of something bigger than myself. I don't know that I was using the affirmations at that point. At that particular point you describe, I was struggling with a lot of things. I was struggling with food and I was struggling with exercise. And I used both of those things to punish myself. And I think I was in such a dark place at that time. And I was so full of self-loathing at that time. And now retrospectively, I can see that I was just trying to grab onto some semblance of control in an experience that just felt completely out of control. But I would exercise obsessively for like 4 hours a day after I'd worked all day. And then I was really, really strict with food. And I can see that I had a very disordered eating and very dysmorphic view of my own body. And that is definitely, that's not a feature, thank goodness, of my experience anymore. But it was at that particular moment in time, I think I was so.
And you're dealing with this chronic pain.
Yes. Yeah. And pain emotionally, just of like where I was and just reconciling lots of different things that had happened in my life. So, yeah.
So then you find yourself in the Holy Land doing Hebrew aerobics.
Hebrew aerobics.
I can make that joke because I'm not Jewish. And so I'm the rabbi Rupert made this joke. But at this point, and then you fall into yoga, and you're saying, okay, well, I've been a seeker for a while. This feels like it could have some answers for me.
Yes.
Where does this take you?
So the particular relationship that took me to Israel ended, but I'd been there a little while and had quite a good community there, and sort of went back and forth. But obviously I wasn't allowed to stay there because I was foreign and didn't have the right visa requirements and that sort of thing, and had been doing bits and pieces there. And I'm just trying to piece together. It feels like such a long time ago. But so the bit that kind of came up in between, gosh, what's the order of operation here? I've completely confused this part of my life in my mind. So at one stage I was in Asia. So I was traveling. I traveled quite a lot. Yeah. Yeah. I left, I went back to Asia and I met some people in.
Did you go to Asia looking on the yoga trail? Was that what took you there? Or were you just traveling now following yoga?
I was traveling. I was mainly traveling at that moment in time, but the yoga thing was definitely like strong in my mind. And then intermittently I was going back to Australia at that point for work, and I was working and
What were you doing?
So as part of the health science thing, I'd done like a massage certification. So I did massage at a friend's clinic that paid quite well, like, because you got like quite a decent amount of money for that.
At this point, you've entered the healing arts.
Yes. Yeah. So I was doing that, and I knew, sort of a bit of herbal medicine and all of these sorts of things. And I would ride for people. So there was like a bit of a mishmash of things that would happen when I went home. And I'd met someone in Thailand who worked for the Red Cross, and he was from Belgium, and he was doing some like local on the ground things in Belgium. And it ended up that we got talking quite a lot at that stage. It was like, I don't think did I have a mobile phone at that stage? I might have had a mobile phone, but it was like sort of the Hotmail Messenger type thing. Like that was like, you had to like log on at the same time. And it was like, do you remember that? There was like an MSN Messenger or something like that. It was something like that.
To me, that only feels like 5 minutes ago, but I remember when Mastodon still fellowed to Mastodon, climbing the swamp. So yeah.
So that was us chatting at that point. And gosh, I'm trying to place my years and the order that I did things in. But when I was sort of dipping around in yoga at home, there was a lady that I spoke to. So my natural inclination, coming from a competitive family and also coming from a position where exercise was like self-punishment and self-flagellation, and I was like using it. And
your parents were competitive runners too, so it's a amount of grueling exercise as part of the deal, right?
Yeah, it was. But they just like we're a very active family, but I don't know that that I used necessarily the gifts that were bestowed to me in the way that I do now. But at that point, I did the types of yoga which was like, you just feel like you want to die at the end of it, and that to me was success.
What kind of yoga is that?
Well, you do like, I did Ashtanga and like sort of like
talk us through for those people that don't know what Ashtanga yoga is. Talk to us about yoga.
So
just before you do that, let me ask you one quick question. Had you found the answer to the pain in your back at this point?
No, but I could see that there was potential of moving in the right direction with it. So I saw like a light for that.
So you felt that the yoga was strengthening you?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us about Ashtanga yoga.
Ashtanga yoga comes out of, so there were 3 main teachers that were students of the main kind of yoga guru who brought it to the West, called Krishnamacharya. And Pattabhi Jois was one of those yoga students. And he didn't really create, but he was the one that sort of popularized this form of yoga called Ashtanga. And there were 2 other teachers that were descendants of that lineage, of the Krishnamacharya lineage, and they were Iyengar. So a lot of people will be familiar with Iyengar yoga, much more structured, a lot of rules around Iyengar yoga that deals with body alignment. And they use quite a lot of props like straps and blocks, and like there's ways of shaping the body towards this particular outcome. And the third person, who's much less known, was Mohan, A.G. Mohan, and his wife Indra, who are very much into the therapeutic side of yoga. And so there were these 3 students that studied with him. Patabi Joyce is from Mysore in India. There's kind of a big movement in Mysore towards Ashtanga. And Ashtanga originally was the form of yoga that was designed for teenage boys, basically. So a very active, very strength-based, very dynamic form of yoga that would suit a boy with a lot of testosterone, a lot of strength, a lot of just physical capacity to do that, and not necessarily designed for women, especially because of the types of breath work that it utilizes and the type of body movement that it utilizes has quite a strong effect on the reproductive system. And because women weren't in mind when that system was around. And so it's just a very, very physical yoga. You go through a set of postures that all form a part of a sequence that are constantly flowing, and you tie in the breath with that. And so it's because there's these set sequences and set levels that you go through in order to kind of like graduate to the next level, your body needs to be able to move in particular ways. And for me, that wasn't part of how my body liked to move, in terms of just my natural inclination. And so I found it quite challenging, but again, it fitted in quite well with trying to make my body do something.
Why were you attracted to that one and not the other 2 types? Why not the therapeutic type, or why not the very structured type? Why this dynamic made for 18-year-old boys type?
Well, it was popular where I was at that moment, and I didn't really realize the lineage that it was springing from initially.
You went to Mysore, did you? You ended up.
No, I didn't. This was at home that I was doing this, and also, I really thought that in order to be doing something good for my body, you had to really feel it, like the no pain, no gain type philosophy. So it just went in line with, I was just trying to escape myself, Rue. Like so I needed to sweat it out. I needed to push myself. I needed to like punish myself to some degree, even though I wouldn't have said that's what I was doing. That's what I needed at the time. And to think of being still just meant that I had to meet myself. And that would probably be one of the worst things that I could think of at that particular
And
moment.
how did you feel it was working for you, just in terms of building strength, or?
Well, I was sore. Like it wasn't really working for me. I had sore knees, I had sore elbows, I had sore, shoulders, because there's a lot of jumping and a lot of like push-up type motions and a lot of very physical things, which for me, if you're doing it repetitively and you're not doing it in a way where the body's able to sustain itself, you develop compensation patterns. And so now it's like, oh gosh, my right shoulder hurts because I'm using that arm more and I'm doing this like 50 times a session. And so that starts to have an effect. But the way out of that was actually following someone that had most likely been in a similar position to me, who was one of my main Ashtanga teachers, and then started studying with Mohan, who was the therapeutic teacher. And she came back from Chennai, which is where he was based, and just started teaching this like incredibly slow form of yoga. And I was like, is this? Like, this is doing nothing. I now need to go for like a 50K run if I do this. Like, that was my mentality. It's not enough to kind of keep me in shape or whatever it is I was supposed to be at that time. And so she sort of sparked a seed in me. And then from there, I did some prodding around on the internet and decided that I was going to go and study with them directly when I was in India. Well, I was going to go to India. Yeah.
So you end up in India, and now you're studying this therapeutic form of yoga.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is your pain getting better?
So Mohan and his wife Indra are quite magical people. And the first course that I did was 8 weeks, and you go and you sit on their concrete floor and you listen all day to them, and you do practices, and they teach you the Vedas and they teach you the everything. And you go and have a consultation with Indra. And Indra is like, because she's a woman, she doesn't get the same accolades as her husband, but actually she's probably the most skilled of the two. But she's just A.G. Mohan's wife, if that makes sense. But she's studied the same as him. She's really the magical one of the two of them. And she, because I was female, she was the one that saw me, because there's quite strict customs there in terms of who sees who. So we go into the room and she asked me to she does gets me to move in a couple of different ways. And their approach is they give you a personal practice. So they actually give you the postures to do based on your mind and your body, which was a first for me because everything else had been generic up until that point. So they design postures for you. They design a sequence for you. And I went in, I can remember it really clearly. I went into her little room and she is like, for the time you are here, you're only doing what I say. You're only doing these postures. Because I was doing my Ashtanga practice in the morning and then going to them, you see. This is the level of my addiction, actually. I was doing something that I thought would keep me strong and fit. And then I was going to go and do the therapeutic yoga, which was the next thing on the side that I could tell other people. And she was like, no, you're not doing that anymore. You're not doing that. And that was like a crisis for me for a month. I did do what she said because I was like, I'm here. It feels very disrespectful to not do what she is asking if I'm going to be in this. But I had a real moment with that. That was the beginning, I think, of breaking. It was basically like an alcoholic arriving and them saying you're not drinking for the next 8 weeks. And you're like, what? That's how it felt. That's how I imagine it would feel. It's like I was so addicted to that as a way of keeping my mind in a container that I could manage, that to think about letting that go was actually terrifying.
So you felt that the Ashtanga was basically keeping the lid on your wobbly mental health, and that if you were to let that go, you might wobble outside the jar, sort of thing.
Yeah. And also beyond that, I think that, and I don't know, I'm sorry, this is going a little bit outside the remit of what your podcast is about, isn't it? But
no, at all. It's how we get to self-actualization.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I think that for me, and the reason that I talk about this, well, I have no shame around it, but also I think that I was going to say women, but I think a lot of people will go through this, where the way that I controlled my life was through controlling my body. And so my thought processes around controlling my body at that moment in time was with punishing exercise. And so if I let that go, I thought that would mean, I would start looking a certain way, which was, again, I didn't even really have ideas about, it's funny to reflect on, because it wasn't so much that I was judging people's body shapes, but for me, it was just control. It was I just was aiming to look a certain way in order to stay controlled. And that involved, I guess I had so much adrenaline coursing through my system that was kind of burning that up as well. And if it wasn't being burned up, then I had to deal with it in other ways.
Right.
But I found, interestingly, that because I am a good student and I do what I'm told, to a certain extent at that moment in time, that I followed the practice. I was like, well, I'm here. And it was actually so beautiful, aside from I would get up in the morning. And for those of you who've been to India, it's it's a mishmash of different things. So on the one hand, you'd have the call to prayer. That's very, very beautiful. So beautiful. I'm up before the sun. I've laid out my little yoga mat. I'm on my little concrete floor. My place is super basic. No toilet, no anything like that. I've got the call to prayer. The air is warm. I'm like, this feels lush. And then all of a sudden someone starts hoiking outside my window, clearing their throat, and and the ablutions begin. You're like, this is India, right? The juxtaposition between, this is the most sublime thing that's ever happened to me, and then all of a sudden someone starts just literally throwing
taking
up
shit right outside your window.
Yeah, exactly. And you're like, well,
right in the eye.
Back to reality. And so that was, and what I noticed over the course of 6 weeks was, with this very, very, very soft and gentle practice, everything started to shift for me at that moment. And so that was a really huge transition, and I kind of dedicated myself to them for a long period of time.
For how long?
Years. I studied with them for years, and I did the practice for years, and I thought.
So you would say Indra,
all I want to do.
What? So it's Mohan and Indra.
Mohan
is the family name.
Yes. Yeah.
They were the Mohans were your mentors, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. But for how long? For a decade? For 5 years?
Yeah. Okay. Decade. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And at that stage as well, like I think this suited me because it meant that I didn't have to show up in life for other things that were challenging to me at that moment. I thought I just wanted to go and be in a cave, and I was just going to be that person that like meditated and did yoga, and I just was going to get enlightened. That was like my idea. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to like check out. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to be in whatever way I need to be in life as much as I need to be. And then I'm just going to do this thing. I'm just going to be by myself and do the thing. And I think that, again, retrospectively, that was very convenient because it, relationships are hard, and like showing up
I
in the
hadn't
world is
noticed.
hard.
No, yeah, really.
And if you can be like, oh, maybe actually the idea is that you should just like be in a cave and secrete yourself away. Like that was quite a attractive idea at that moment because.
And was that promoted by the Mohans, or was that more your own idea that was what you had to do?
They were very much not necessarily in overt ways, because I don't want to seek to represent them at all. They're very encouraging and will create a supportive framework around whatever your life is showing.
Okay.
But they're ultimately, as a practice, like they're aiming to bring the mind towards one pointed focus. And that is about controlling earthly desires, right? So
leaving the senses behind, leaving the body behind.
Yes.
Mind. Yeah. Transcendent.
So, and there, for instance, if I just remember hearing him talk one day, and that when he traveled, he didn't go looking around at things. He would go back to his room and meditate. And I remember thinking, wow, like that's interesting, isn't it? Like to not be interested in what's going on around you in a place that you've never been before, but instead to just do the work that you came for and then just go back and meditate was kind of like jarring thought for me. And that, relationship has a purpose for procreation. And then, beyond that, it's like, not that they weren't very loving towards each other, but they understood that their ultimate purpose was to unite with the divine. And that was bigger than what either of them were individually or what their relationship was. And so, there are a lot of beautiful things that came out of that experience for me, and a lot of problematic things that came out of that for me. I won't speak for them or their lineage, but for me, from a, cultural perspective and from a perspective of who I understand myself to be now and who I understand myself to have always been, but just didn't really recognize. Because
so at a certain point, did you become like an instructor? You were
I was flat out teaching.
Are you like?
I did all of the things. Yeah.
Being flown around the world teaching wealthy Chinese businessmen type thing, yoga or.
Yeah, I did work in China for a period in Hong Kong, and I went to China, and I was teaching all over the place. I was in Bali. I was going to set up retreat centers and yoga centers.
So this is success. I mean, you've now found this thing with this therapeutic yoga. I presume it's making you feel better to some degree. It must be making other people feel better.
That's the irony, isn't it? It gave me a focus. I don't know that it made me feel better. Okay. It gave me a focus, and I think that was a relief, having been swimming around in this, what am I going to do with my life thing? All of a sudden, like I was something that I could attach something to.
You're good at it. And people want you. Yeah. You're marketable.
Yeah.
You've mastered it. You've found mastery of something. Yeah.
Enough to be able to impart.
Right. Where are the horses in this? Have they gone completely by the by at this point?
They have at this point. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you missing them somehow?
Yeah.
Are you not thinking about that?
No, I am missing them. Yeah, I am missing them. Yeah. Yeah. And I had like, I had crises of sorts again, because I was traveling quite extensively and I was doing other work in between there. But, you see a lot of people in Bali, for instance. I saw people that were expats, and there's like an expat community. And I just remember feeling deeply uncomfortable with the situation, in that they're very affluent in the country that they've arrived in, because obviously the currency that they had come with is worth a lot more than the currency they're playing with in that moment. They all have housekeepers, and there's just this like residue of colonialism and hierarchical living that really, really made me uncomfortable. And the yoga community in those places is very much a part of that, because a lot of the reason why people go there in the first place is to seek some form of wellness and wellness solutions and wellness retreats. And there's a lot of people that have set up things there that are kind of doing so under this pseudo idea that they're, helping humanity. But actually what I saw was just like, well, this is just a convenient, I don't know, it just really didn't sit well with me. And you saw that in a few different places, that kind of, oh, we're helping out here, but actually it's like, no, you're under a really good wicket and you're doing so at the expense of local people. And it just was weird to me. Yeah. And so I always had this thought of like, this can't be the end point, because I remember sitting in a cafe and I like saw a group of men come in that were all in their little like, togas or whatever.
I was going to say Seven Dwarves outfits. I'm on that.
They're in Goa. It's like there's a look, and I looked at them and I thought, I can't be that. I just can't end up like that. Like I can't be that. And I thought at some point when you've stayed away too long, you can't go back, because you've either absented yourself from your culture, or financially you just can't go back because now you're used to living in India and everything is so cheap. And so I always had this idea of this was temporary, but I wasn't quite sure where things were going to lead next.
So where did they lead next, and what was the transition point?
So the transition point was, there are a few things that happened, because this is sort of like a few, over the course of many years. I was in Europe for a period, and I went to see my friend who was the Red Cross worker that I mentioned.
The Israeli guy.
Previously.
Yeah, no, the Belgian guy.
Yeah. And there were some local projects that they were involved with that I was just volunteering at and helping out with. And then around that time, the tsunami happened. It was like 2004. And so there were all people getting dispatched over there, initially to Thailand, then to Sri Lanka. And Chennai, where I'd been studying in India, was marginally affected, like southern India, but not so badly as the other places. And I had the opportunity to go. And I'd already been doing different pieces of work that were like aid, humanitarian related projects whenever I could around the place, both personally and then kind of hooking in with other groups. And so I went and decided to be a part of the like dispatch that went to Sri Lanka. And so shortly after that happened, that's where I arrived and was there for the next 12 months or so. And I think that was a real sort of turning point for me as well, where I was like, I need something. I just need to figure myself out. Like I really need to figure myself out. And I went back to New Zealand after that. That's where I was like, okay.
Hold on. You must have done something quite interesting down there at Sri Lanka. What did you do in the aftermath of the tsunami? Can't just gloss over that. Come on.
Yeah. Well, there were sort of different.
Okay, that's enough. Let's move on. Sorry.
Yeah, there were different parts to it. The first part was anyone who's done any sort of aid work, and I had been doing things prior, so it wasn't sort of my first foray, but there's a huge amount of corruption in Asia and in, Indian subcontinent and all around there. And I'd been traveling and working all around there. So I was kind of used to the game. But after the tsunami, it kind of hit new levels, especially with the president of Sri Lanka, who was female at that time. I'm not quite sure who it is now, but there was a huge outpouring of public donations, because, this is one of the first times really, I think, where something to that scale had been caught on camera for the mainstream to be able to experience. And so, people holidaying had caught it on their mobile phones, and it was all over the news, and it was so shocking. Like it was really, really so shocking that it moved people to give money in ways that they hadn't really given money before. And so, of course, this goes to the powers that be initially in the country. That doesn't go to the people who need it. It goes to the people who you hope are going to equitably distribute it. And in Sri Lanka, that definitely wasn't the case. So she profited very handsomely and fabulously off people's donations in that first instance. And so when you work or are with a organization that have a huge administrative background, there is also limitations in what you can do because everything has to go through process, of course. So how publicly good this is to talk about. But anyway, so that was the first part of it was with the organization. Then what we decided was that we would come back independently. And we thought, well, if we had like
you and a small group of people there.
Yes. Yeah. If we came back and we independently raised money and we had like thousands of dollars in our own bank accounts we just directly like went in and just helped people out, we could do something faster than we could if we have to wait for this whole process to happen. And so the person I was with, he was a very skilled photographer. I had sort of other skills that were going on. And the other thing that we did at that point in time was my main role was I worked with the children quite a lot. And it was very much making it up as you go. So I could see that the kids were quite traumatized, but also desperate to be children. And so I said to them, because one of the things I was really aware of was the sort of white savior thing that happens, or you create that mentality where you're handing out money and it's a very disempowering situation for people, especially individuals, with their own pride and their own stuff going on. And so with the children, I thought, well, how can we make it so that they feel like they're actually raising their own money, even if it's not actually the case? So that there's like a sentiment that they have a part in what they're receiving. And so I said, look, we've got a museum, sort of art gallery, a couple of different art galleries that are interested in auctioning off your pictures, because I know that you do really good art. You've been drawing with me and you do really good pictures. So do you want to draw some pictures for me? And so they started producing this artwork that was just like wild. And I didn't ask them to draw about the tsunami. I just said, you can draw whatever you want. It doesn't matter. And they drew these like big black waves with like teeth coming out of them and like bodies floating on top of the water and like people hanging off trees and like basically like whatever was in their subconscious. These little kids that were just like would come out with these like pictures of like death and destruction and like metaphorical representations of the wave. And I was like, oh wow, that's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you. Just be like, wow, like where am I going to take this? Like it was a thing. And so I collected all of their artwork and I said, thank you, we're going to take it. And there's people, in places that might be able to help us right now that are going to auction off your work. And then we're going to come back and help you. And that's kind of what we did. And we also had prints and things that we made from there. And we were just hard out fundraising when we got home. And then we went back directly with the money in our bank accounts and just worked as nobodies, but already knew kind of the ins and outs of what was needed and where to put the money. So we just picked a village basically, and we picked families that we thought we could most influence and help. And then we just did what we could there. Yeah.
Why didn't you keep doing that? And what happened to the yoga in between?
Yoga, I was just practicing myself, but I wasn't, that was kind of the core of my work, was being there. I mean, you can live very, very simply in places like that on next to nothing. So
right. So you're doing this and you're helping rebuild communities there with money that you've raised directly. What takes you away from that?
It came to a natural conclusion, I think, where you realize the end of your capacity. Well, A, you run out of money. And B, you get to the end of your usefulness. I think there's like a natural evolution of chapters that people go through in those experiences where you realize like now something bigger needs to happen. And also just for myself, I had started to get to that place where I was like, I have to make a decision about, I have to be a grown up basically. Like what can I wanted to have roots a little bit. Like I wanted to find a place where I could.
You've been traveling for a while by now, yeah.
Yeah, I'd been traveling for a long time. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of it with a sort of lost feeling inside. And so I was like, I think I'm going to go back to New Zealand and I'm just going to land there. The landscape always felt really good to me there or here. And I never, there's aspects of Australia which are always going to be a part of me, which actually is to do with the landscape as well, and smells and animals and those sorts of things. But I never really wanted to stay. I knew that wasn't the place that I was going to stay. And I think actually, I have a nomadic tendency anyway that perhaps I struggled to reconcile for a long time. But yeah.
So you end up back in New Zealand.
Yeah.
You followed healing. You've achieved a certain mastery in a healing form of yoga. You've then taken that healing into social healing with advocacy and rebuilding of communities after the tsunami. And this is all pretty significant work. And then you arrive as Jane Pike again in New Zealand. What do you do then?
At first I was writing. I had two things going on. I was just working in a shop, like just to have money. And it was a retail shop selling like different clothes and other things. And so I was sitting there and
did that feel a little surreal after?
Yeah, it was very surreal. It was very, very surreal. But it was kind of welcome at the same time, because I needed to regroup. Like
simple and stable. Right.
Yes. Yeah. It had been a lot. And so it was something where I got like a regular amount of income that was like very, very little. But it was enough to kind of like pay rent and eat and do all the things. And then I started to write, because at that point I wanted to write a book. And also it sounds so, I'm just dropping things in, but I'm not quite sure how they happen. I did have a column. I had like a column in a couple of newspapers at one point in time that I was writing for, and I'd managed to kind of weasel my way in there.
You arrived back and started freelancing a bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Had you been dabbling in writing through this whole time? Like,
not really. I just pitched myself.
Yeah. Oh, really? And but you always sort of wanted to write? I always
loved writing. Yeah. Words were always something that I loved doing. And so I thought initially I wanted to write a children's book, but I don't know. I always wrote. And so that seemed like, that's where the journalism came from, right? Like that's
and
where
what were you writing? What columns are you writing for these papers? Stuff from what you've been doing?
Yeah. So at one point I won a competition, and then afterwards they said, "Oh, actually, we kind of like your work. Would you come on as a regular?" We've had like good responses to the work, and it was fashion. It was like a fashion club.
Of course it was. And rights. And
I won a competition to be like the reporter, if you like, over a fashion week. And so I did that, and then that stuff came out of that. But it was I ended up quitting because it was such a like wildly misogynistic place. It was really stuck in the dark ages. That's probably one of my proudest moments, where I like quit on principle of something, and then later on, and they were really assholes about it, and then later on they begged for me to come back, and I got to say no again, which was like, this beautiful moment in my life, actually.
You have a little plaque on the wall.
Yeah.
No to the misogynist.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, so now you've fallen into writing. Is it all fashion, or do you start to go
writing and retail? Yeah, that's right. Fashion and retail. So that was just literally for bill paying practices, and then behind the scenes I was playing with fiction writing. Yeah, and so the idea was that I was going to write my own thing and just be single and have enough money to get by, so that I could do that and just be free, basically.
How long did that last?
No, not very long. I met my husband fairly soon after that.
So then how does it go from you're back from this significant adventure?
Yeah.
You've learned these skills, but now you appear to have abandoned them. You're gone a whole new direction. You're writing now. You're doing bill paying, fashion and retail stuff, but you're writing. How do you go from that to running this really successful, interesting online equestrian and nervous system thing?
Yeah.
How does it happen?
So being back in New Zealand, I did start to sort of play in the horse world again, although I didn't have my own horse to start with. And then when I met my husband, I was on the North Island at that point. He was on the South Island, and I ended up moving down here, and we had some land together down here. And so he said, "Do you want to get a horse?" And I said, "I don't think you understand what that means." And he was like, "Oh, yes, I do." And I was like, "No, no. Like if I have horses, I horse. I'm not a casual horser. So it's either I'm in or and he's like, "Oh, no, no, no." And I'm like, "No, no, no. No, I don't know that you you really understand." And so clearly he didn't, because we got a horse. And then that's led to me to where I am now. So, but it was beautiful, in that, like, this is, I guess, where all of the different seeds start to merge. And the initial idea for it was that I thought, okay, there are a lot of people struggling with physical things to do with riding, and with my background in like therapeutic yoga and like body stuff, I dabbled with starting to help people from that perspective. And then it became apparent to me through our conversations that a lot of what people were struggling with was like confidence and anxiety issues. And I had things to say about that were helpful to people, but I had never considered that to be something that would be like, it was so natural to me to talk about that stuff. And it was so in me to talk about it that it wasn't anything that I considered to be a skill. Until I recognized that, oh, maybe I do have something to say that people would like to hear about. And so what mainly started was I started a Facebook page, and this was kind of in the early days of Facebook, where I just blogged. Like, I wrote every day, and I blogged about the things that to do with the mind and emotions and the body from the perspective of all the things that I've been studying and learning about, and people were really interested in it. Like, I started to have a really solid following. I never sold anything for like years. I literally just wrote and put lots of free stuff out there. I just shared what I knew. And I started to get a bit of a following off the back of that. And I'd always studied, like, it was in the meantime, I was studying like loads of different like mental skills and like I've done masters in hypnotherapy and loads of different things, different psychology studies, and lots of different things kind of running in the background. I actually started another university course in violence and trauma, that when I got back from the tsunami,
how to cause it or how to recover from it?
How to recover from it. But then I realized that actually just at the time, that is something that I'd wished I'd continued on with. But being in the position I was at the time, I was one of the few people that was sort of working full time and trying to study full time, and I just couldn't do it. I had no support from the outside. So it was like, I can't actually live and eat and do this at the same time. So that fell away at that point. And it really did evolve from there. When I had my first child, Flynn, so he's 12 this year, that was kind of the seed of like I think partially it was the seed of frustration that bore the actual business in its form that it is now, in terms of like, I've lost my autonomy. My partner is working really, really long hours and is away a lot, and I'm completely reliant on other people to look after my baby if I want to do anything that's like separate to me. So what can I do that will like feed this sort of intellectual energy that I have and creative
Because by now you're
energy that
living in a remote part of the South Island.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Having gone from this completely cosmopolitan life, now you're
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
down there
Yeah.
in DC, but isolated.
Yeah. And so that's how it started. I started putting together like little packages for writing initially, like continuing on with the blog that I'd started, and then putting together little packages. And at that stage, like, anything internet wise was a very new endeavor. Like, now memberships and stuff like that are so common that everyone has a membership. At that point, I remember talking to a software person and him not even knowing what I was talking about. He's like, "Oh, that's not a thing. You can't do that. That would be like $20 million to like create that." And I was like, "Oh, I have no money. Excellent." So everything started with zero money. Like I had no money. I had to do it all myself. If I wanted to figure it out, I needed to learn it, or it needed to cost like only $5. It was basically like my budget. And so I did, yeah, I'm sort of studying in the background all the way through. I'm starting to get like a small amount of people, to the point where the first thing I offered was a boot camp. I called it a boot camp, and it went for 6 months, and I gave people content like at the start of each month that was specifically focusing on like confidence type things. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I am like, this is so much money. I think I charged them like $100 each, and there was maybe 15 people in it. And I was like, I've made it. Like, this is it. I've got like something coming in that just felt like this phenomenal achievement. And there was another really kind of cataclysmic moment where all the way through I've had to teach myself. So I've always been doing like business courses, or I'd look for someone that was doing something similar in terms of a format that I thought was good, even if it was a completely unrelated topic. And I just study their thing to like look at their format. And so at one point, I signed up for this business course, and it was $800. It was 800 New Zealand dollars, which for me was like, this is outrageous. Like, and I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my husband. I just put it on my credit card. And I was like, okay, I'm going to put it on the credit card. And because I've done this so deceitfully, I have to make it back by the end of it. Like, I have to make it back like that. There's no choice about that. And so within the 6 weeks I created 2 different courses off the back of that, one which was competitively focused and one which was confidence focused. And then that kind of led me to the membership, just through realizing what different people needed at different moments. So, yeah.
Now, Confident Rider and Joyride are these known things, and you've got a following all over the world. What would you say now it is that you do and offer? If you were to put it in your, I'm not even the elevator pitch, but if you were to say more or less in a nutshell what it is you give people through this online thing involving their nervous system, what is it?
So it's a movement-based program. And we are ultimately looking to create nervous system adaptability. So we're interested in getting people into a position and a place where, if we think of it technically, their brain and body are responding accurately to what's going on in their life. And for lots of people, they're not responding accurately. They're either in Groundhog Day situations, they're finding themselves overreacting or underreacting. And that shows up in writing, that shows up in life, that shows up mentally, physically, and emotionally. And so I look at biomechanics, but I look at it from a nervous system perspective, which is quite a different lens to view it from than traditional biomechanics. We look at mindset and also emotions within the template that the nervous system creates as well. But I think that there's a slightly different flavor also to what I offer that perhaps I haven't been so vocal about in the beginning, in that I'm really fascinated by the body, and I have so much reverence and respect for science and everything that it offers us, and have, gone deeply down that rabbit hole and will continue to myself. However, there also has to be room for the mystical and the magical. And I think that a lot of our conversations, while they're rooted in that scientific understanding, also allow space for just what it means to be human and what it means to be, a part of the world that we're in and the landscape that we're in, and to recognize that there is something bigger than us at play. So, it's all of those things. Does that make sense?
This sounds like it goes far beyond helping people out with their confidence on horseback.
Yeah, the horses are such a gift in that firstly, they give people a reason to look at things that might not be comfortable, acceptable, quote unquote, or okay to look at without them. So, for instance, people may well recognize that they struggle with anxiety generally, or they're feeling like, gosh, is this kind of it as far as their life is concerned? But they don't give themselves permission to really look at those things in isolation, or they wouldn't go to someone to talk about them because that would be just kind of not something that they would ever do. But if it relates to their riding, or they can use their horse as like the thing outside of themselves, which is the conversation kickstarter, then it takes the pressure off them, it takes the spotlight off them, and it just provides a way in to have bigger conversations that just feel more possible.
What
And
would you
that's what my
say?
experience has been. Yeah.
What would you say is the prevalent thing about the nervous system in the brain that you find yourself now helping people with the most?
So I think that one of the gifts of the time that we're in is that this nervous system awareness is becoming much more mainstream, that it's not uncommon, especially in the world that you're moving in and the world that I move in, for people to have some kind of understanding about the nervous system. Whereas that used to be like 10 or 20 years ago, like such a foreign idea to talk about. And I think that just in science in general, it's really like there's been huge leaps and evolutions in understanding that. And so for me, what my work involves, which is not something that I see commonly talked about and or offered, is this understanding of the different motor reflex patterns that we move through when we're in the fight flight response. And so if we consider, as we go into our sympathetic system, there are these templates, if you like, that the body utilizes in order to fulfill the function of that nervous system state. So fight, flight, freeze, and there's a couple of
You're
different
saying,
stages.
just for those people who are not nervous system people, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight, flight, freeze.
Fight, flight nervous system.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
So go on.
Yeah. So within the fight, flight nervous system, there are these different reflex patterns, which are essentially structural or movement patterns. That means that for any of us who move into a fight response, for any of us that move into a flight response or a freeze response, there is a way that your body moves itself, a way that your body orients itself from the inside out that is observable and discernible, in that, like, if Rue or myself was in a fight, I would be able to observe that by the way the structure of the body moves. So there's a template that creates. And so alongside that physical template, and again, we do that in order to maximize the purpose of that particular state. So for fight, I'm really wanting to maximize my force. For flee, I'm wanting to maximize my acceleration. And so the body orients itself in order to fulfill that function. And this has been such a revelation to me, because a lot of what we see as dysfunction, dis-ease, disharmony in the body is the body operating more often than not from one of these sympathetic patterns, from one of these fight-flight patterns. And the brain in and of itself, for a number of different reasons, has lost the capacity to move fluently between the different nervous system states, which is essentially, if I am a human with adaptability and who isn't stuck on a particular channel, I'm able to flip in between any of the states, both fight, flight, and parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is like just optimal mode of functioning, sort of normal everyday functioning.
Being okay, basically.
Being okay. And the survival nervous system is really only designed for me being under physiological threat. So for most of us, hopefully, who aren't in a position where we're under physiological threat in the day-to-day, there is no reason for us to be in our sympathetic nervous system. But many of us are living there, and that creates different problems for us on every level.
So would you say that the majority of people that you find that you're working with, despite the comfort of Western life, the physical comforts of Western life, are in fact, for a multitude of reasons, basically living in their fight-flight nervous system?
Yeah, I would say that
even when there is no elephant coming at them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's like a meme that goes around saying, I want my nervous system my fight flight nervous system to kick on in response to the tiger not reading the email, sort of thing. And it's like it's true, right?
Why do you think we're all living in this fight flight freeze when we're not in war zones?
Because we have become 50 steps removed from our environment. We're no longer getting the amount of movement novelty or sensory feedback that we would if we were part of a hunter-gatherer type setting. And that starts to intimately affect how our nervous system is able to function and
So
operate.
basically, we're stressed because we're not living in the natural environment that our organism is programmed for.
Yeah, it's what has happened now is that meeting our life needs and meeting our survival needs is a cognitive choice rather than a physical reality. So if I was part of a living situation where I was required to be in the world and that meant that I had to move, so I had to look after the people in my community, I had to go out and search for my food, I had to tend to my shelter, I had to be in my environment as part of that reciprocal economy. I'm always moving. My sensory system, my sensory nervous system is always getting stimulated. I'm always encountering novelty, which means that my brain is always receiving information about my current reality. And now we're in a situation where movement has become a choice and we are no longer required to be in the world should we choose not to be. And so the
We
amount
could
that
sit in our rooms and order Uber Eats.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's the example that I use. I can be in this office, I can order food, I can ring someone to come and fix the roof, I can get on Facebook, and I could essentially sit in my chair. Perhaps I wouldn't be thriving, but I could stay here for decades and still live. That's completely possible. And so now, if we think
And
of
there's
it
an
through
innate
the lens
stress
of
to that.
yeah, well, it's even more than that. It's like if we use the example of a traumatic situation, if I go out and ride my horse or I just go out into the world and something happens to me that I register as upsetting to the point where I might label it as traumatic. If I sit in my office, essentially, in order for that experience to have context, in order for my brain to be able to contextualize it as that happened yesterday or that happened this morning or that happened last year, I need to be constantly uploading new information. I need to be constantly in the world. My sensory system needs to be bringing in new information to my brain. So my brain is not prioritizing or sitting front and center that experience. It's because I'm required to be out there. And so when that happens, things get contextualized. It's like I had that kind of shitty experience, but that happened last year. Now what happens is that we have this unpleasant event. We come and sit wherever it is we are in our home and we don't go out. We don't engage. Our sensory system isn't getting stimulated. We're not moving in novel ways. And so it becomes the dominant process for the brain. It becomes the dominant pattern that isn't being challenged by any other information coming in.
So basically the trauma doesn't get massaged out of us. We don't, is that what you're saying? That this, I'm going to go back to this novel movement thing because it's a novel thing to hear. It's still a novel term to me, novel movement. I think listeners would like to have that explained to them. But basically these different forms, are you saying that these different forms of movement that we would encounter in a natural situation where we've got to walk, we've got to climb, we've got to swim, we've got to bump against the trees, we've got to dig, we've got to whatever, give us a certain input through the nervous system that assuages quote unquote traumatic events and then leads us to resilience. And then if we don't have that, we kind of get stuck in those unpleasant experiences. Is that basically what you're driving?
Is it all right for me to give a little background to it?
Please.
I think without it, it's a little more difficult to understand. If you think of it in very simplistic terms, the brain is always looking to answer the question, are we safe? That's the baseline of any type of conversation that the brain is having with the environment. And we're relational creatures, meaning we're always looking to assess what it is, how it is we fit in this situation, in any situation that we come into. So the way that we do that is through sensory information. Sensory information comes into the brain. We have 19 different sensors that we're constantly feeling into the environment with. And it's coming into this place in our brain called the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is using that information to answer that question, are we safe? The answer is either yes, no, or maybe, right? So if it's yes, then what gets sent out is a motor pattern, which is a movement pattern, right? So sensory in, motor pattern out, movement pattern out. That motor pattern can either be a parasympathetic pattern or a sympathetic pattern. It's either one of those two things. If the brain says, yes, you're safe, then we create a new pattern that is based on matching the circumstance. So I create a whole new response based on what it is that I'm in relationship with. And that's something I haven't experienced before because it's not a reflex, right? It's a new pattern that the brain creates. When the answer is no, then the brain chooses which of these reflex states are we going to choose? Are we going to put him in fight? Are we going to put him in flight? Are we going to put him in freeze or collapse? That's the template that it chooses. If it's maybe, the brain always errs on the side of caution. And so we go into the sympathetic system, right? Just as a just in case policy. So that's it. Sensory information comes in, a movement pattern gets set out. The movement pattern is either parasympathetic or sympathetic. That's the sort of the basis of it. So in order for our sensory system to stay alive, and remembering the sensory system is what the brain needs to make accurate decisions about the situation that it's in order for the sensory system to be alive, it needs to be constantly stimulated. And it gets constantly stimulated through interactions with different experiences that capture our attention. We're always looking to be efficient. So basically the brain, as soon as something is no longer novel, it creates a pattern for it. It creates an understanding for it. So it doesn't constantly have to process what it is that's going on. And so novelty is what keeps our sensory nervous system alive. Now, if you're constantly engaging in your environment, it's constantly novel because it's constantly changing. If
the
you're
weather
constantly
changes, the wind changes, the ground underfoot changes.
Nothing is ever the same, even if you're treading the same path every day.
Got it.
So
Which it could be hard depending if it's raining.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and if you put your awareness on different parts of your body as you go through the world as well, that's changing, like because your body is in constant change. And so what we have in traditional societies is a setup where our nervous system is supported for optimal function. And so when we get into modern day living, what we have now is, if you ask any adult that you know, I will safely say this, the majority of them, I would say perhaps 10% will fall outside this window, will be able to tell you exactly what they do and how they do it over a given week. Like they'll get up on Monday and maybe they'll go to the gym and then they'll go to work and then they'll eat this lunch and then they'll come home. There'll be like a predictable set of ways that they move their body. And most of the time they'll do that with headphones on, or they'll do that with some form of distraction. So they're not even really present with what it is that they're doing in their environment. And so the brain has already recognized this is no longer novel. Like there's no new sensory information coming in through this. And so we get stuck in these sort of set patterns, which start to become predictable to the brain, and it's not being stimulated in any way. And then as well, because of modern living, what happens as we enter our fight-flight nervous system is the sensory system gets turned off. And the reason for that is protective. So if someone punches me in the face, I don't want to feel all the feelings because that limits my ability to respond in the moment. And if I'm in conservation of energy mode, for instance, which is like collapse, essentially, it's sort of hibernation mode for humans, or it's the same for mammals. Yeah. But exactly. You just like your sensory system is not what's feeling into the world. You're essentially literally introverted at that moment in time. And so by design, we're not supposed to live in our sympathetic or fight-flight nervous system. We're supposed to be like flicking in and out of it. But now we have a lifestyle set up where people are in their sympathetic nervous system and not coming out. They're not being stimulated to come out of it. So the sensory system is getting switched off.
And
the
that's
brain no
depression,
longer
that's
has
anxiety, that's
the
all the
brain no longer has fresh information. And so it's just always erring on the side of caution and staying in the reflex system. And so now we have all of these pathologies and all of these behaviors that are.
So what do you do with your web-based business that helps people to bust out of this and get back to a more natural way of moving that can then bring them back to their parasympathetic? Can you explain how you help?
Yeah, so it's not even bringing back to parasympathetic. It's just creating that accurate responsiveness. So nothing is good or bad. It's just like if you're supposed to be there, then you want to be there, and if you're not, sort of thing. But we talk about being dominantly parasympathetic, which for me in my life situation, for instance, I'm not under physiological threat. So there's no need for me to be.
Except for every time you climb in the saddle, you just kid yourself that you're not.
Yeah, true. But, more than 50% of the time I would want to be operating out of the parasympathetic. That might be different if I'm on the front line in Afghanistan, then it would be more appropriate for me to be operating from my sympathetic more than 50% of the time. But I use movement-based processes and a practice that really activates the sensory system. So it's all about re-engaging the sensory nerves, rehabituating the sensory nerves to send signals to the brain again. And when that happens, you start to release some of the patterns that have been held there in over different periods of time. And so essentially what I'm working with is a brain mapping or a body mapping process where we're updating the brain map, because your brain map gets distorted when you are in sympathetic for a long period of time. I probably complicated things now by introducing that, but basically just using movement to activate the sensory system.
How do you show, and what movements are you showing people? Are you falling back in your yoga, or are you doing other things? And how are you showing people these things?
I don't do any yoga anymore. I don't do any yoga. I don't do any breath work anymore. I've completely changed my track.
And so if I'm a member on this website, what are you showing me and how?
Yeah. So there are a few different things. The movement practices themselves focus on specific body parts. So we'll go through what's some examples. So last week we did the talus bone, which is part of the ankle, and we'll do the heel next week, and we'll do the shin and shoulder blades and ribs, and we've done the rectus abdominis muscles. We'll do different developmental movement patterns. But basically, it's based on the premise that the body moves differently in parasympathetic and sympathetic system. The way that we start to activate sensory nerves is to bring awareness. I work with a 2-point awareness process where we focus on 2 points in a specific part of the body and just observe what's happening. And that starts to activate the sensory system, which overall kicks back into the unconscious brain, and then you start to habituate these sensory feedback loops. But basically, it's just a movement practice that focuses on different body parts. So we're mapping the body by going through different structural parts, noticing different points on the part of the body that we're focusing on with view to activating the sensory system in that area. And that overall starts to kick the brain back into a different mode of functioning.
Okay. And then overall, by then going through these various different parts of the body, through these different types of observation and movement, you get to a sort of a whole at a certain point where you've sort of retrained the body and the brain to basically come to more functionality.
Yeah. So if you think of it, we have something in our brain called place cells and grid cells, and they're cells of location. So basically, my brain has a map of everything that's in my body in relationship to each other. So for instance, it knows where my wrist is in relationship to my elbow cap, and it knows where my knee is in relationship to my ankle. And it also knows where all my organs
at the end
are.
of your hands.
Yeah. It also knows where all my organs are and all of those sorts of things. So that's part of my sensory motor map that's in my brain. And when that sensory motor map is accurate, so when it's updated and the brain has accurate information about the different location landmarks of the body, it's able to accurately place me in relationship to my environment. And so that is through my sensory system. I basically got a series of active sensory feedback loops that are feeling into the environment, giving my brain information so my brain can respond accurately. And when we start to get into fight flight, more often than not, that brain map starts to get distorted. It can get distorted through paying attention to sensation too much. So how I feel, the sensation that's in my body, that's separate to location. And when we have a distorted sensory motor map, the sensory system gets switched off. And again, the brain's unable to accurately make decisions. And you experience this all the time when you're in a place of high anxiety. It's you're no longer responding accurately. Or you can see that in someone else. They just have this kind of complete discombobulated view of themselves in relationship to the world. And so you don't actually have to, for as long as the brain has a few active sensory loops to go on, you can really start to change your experience of the world. And so we do that through this 2-point process, which is in line with activating these place cells and grid cells, which is just an awareness process. And the other thing is, everything that I talk about here might sound confusing. You don't need to know any of it in order for it to work. You don't need to know how it works in order for it to work. It's kind of like the horseboy stuff. If you experience it, it doesn't matter why or how. It's just, it will work because there's a way that the body responds to the process that allows that to be the case. And it's the same here. My process is I love to understand things, and there are other people that love to understand things. So I lay out these processes as to this is why it works. But the reality is, if you come in and just do the practice, you can understand nothing and still get the benefits of it because it's just part of the physiological process.
Did you have a mentor similar to your mentor with yoga, or your mentors with yoga? Who mentored you in this deep nervous system stuff? Because I work a lot with the nervous system with regards to autism and that sort of thing, but I have not dived into it as deeply as you have, and I'm fascinated by this. Who schooled you in this? What's the story?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm still being schooled. I still have multiple schoolings. It's schoolings a week with it, and have been now for the past few years. So Alicia Fajardo is my mentor. She works with holistic biomechanics. And
Alicia Fajardo.
Yes, yeah. And so she is my person basically that I refer to and talk to and have learned a huge amount of. And so
how did you find your way to her? Was it again seeking answers for your own pain, or was it more just curiosity?
I mean, that has been, when we talk about the pain aspect, I've definitely, I'm completely pain-free now. That's been probably the last 5 years or so.
And that's been through this work. So would you say you're this whole conversation we've had, which began with forms of physical and psychological, emotional and physical pain, has been assuaged? You could say, I, Jane Pike, have experienced this in my body and brain. The shit works, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see it in my membership as well. But it's not an easy process.
How did you encounter Alicia?
Alicia, yeah.
Alicia, sorry.
Yeah.
Alicia Furtado, I got the
Yeah. So let me just think. So my initial interest, so I started the work, I guess, from a much more mental skills perspective, like a top-down perspective. And that was about kind of like mental strength, I guess, kind of like harnessing mental strength and like positive thinking and mental toughness and all of those types of words, which make me throw up in my mouth a little bit now. But all of those types of words were my interest to start with. And one of the things about those things is that you're always behind the 8 ball, right? Like you can only change a thought to a positive thought after you've already had the negative thought. And so you're always kind of chasing your tail a little bit there. But the interesting thing is that I realized that those skills and understandings had a shelf life. As far as like for some people, they work just sort of depended on the start point. And I got to a stage myself where I was having like a meltdown in the arena one day that wasn't just in relationship to what was going on. It was more actually just a life circumstance at the time.
This is at home on your own horse in New Zealand.
Yeah, and I just remember thinking like, no, I was at a clinic, even worse. I was at a clinic with an audience, which is
clinic for those non-horsey people does not mean she went to the doctors. It means
but she should have at that moment.
A public horse training event. For some weird reason, we horsey people call them clinics. God knows why. And I've seen that kind of. True. What do you mean you went to a clinic with your horse, or they allowed you to like tie it up outside, yes, it's no. I didn't go to the doctor. Okay, so fine. Yeah. So you're at a horse training event. And you're there as a horse trainer?
No, I'm there as a student.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm there as a student. Yes, I have a meltdown. I have an internal meltdown trying to hold it together, and I just
up because
I think it was more the context of the situation. Okay. I had 2 young, very expressive horses, but that normally wouldn't bother me. It was more just, I think that,
expressive,
I had
explosive.
Yeah. But also just, I guess I had a lot of respect for the trainer. I really wanted to do a good job and I felt like I wasn't doing a good job. And I just put a lot of pressure on myself to be something other than what I was able to be in that moment. And that was what precipitated the experience. But afterwards, it created a whole change because I was like, well, if I can't do this based on all the things I teach and I live and breathe this stuff, then how can I expect someone else to do it that perhaps isn't doing 20% of the work that I do or thinking about it the way that I think about it? How can I expect it to work? And so I had a crisis of sorts after that. And then I went on a whole different exploration, which led me in the first instance to somatic experiencing, which is a lot of the work that's based of Peter Levine's. And he does a lot of, nervous system trauma based work. And I did loads and loads of study and loads of different workshops with people who were his colleagues and or students. And the work that I'm teaching now Alicia was a guest speaker on one of those workshops.
Okay.
And I was there thinking, what is this? Like, this is so random. Like, and
a little bit like your reaction to the more therapeutic yoga after the hard yoga.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it was like, but there was a part of me which was super curious. And I think that was the intuitive part that just was like, keep going, like I had the little
you applied it
like,
to yourself.
You've found something. Yeah, you found something. You need to like investigate this further. And a lot of the questions that I had that had very loose answers that weren't satisfying to me. And I think I'm in a fortunate position in that because I'm teaching things, I'm not just finding out things from a personal perspective. Loose answers don't hold because I'm going to be questioned as well.
Okay.
So it's like, you need to be able to tell me what's going on here. Otherwise, because I need to know, right? I need to know who this best suits, who this best fits.
And Alicia could give you these answers. So certainly she's explaining it in a way that goes to the source inside the nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Quick question. You say you don't do any yoga anymore or any breath work. No. Why not? Why not integrate the two? What makes you say, okay, well, I've moved away from that now?
Yeah. So one thing that I always encourage people to do is to investigate the lineage of whatever it is that they are engaging in as far as processes. And not all, because I will, I don't want to ever paint the brush widely across everything, but a lot of the lineages of yoga and the ones that I was practicing come from aesthetic. It's not aesthetic.
Asceticism.
Asceticism. They come from asceticism.
Removing yourself from the body.
Yes. And so a lot of meditation practices are for that as well, right? So like, it's about moving towards enlightenment. It's about moving towards mergence with the divine, like in whatever way that manifests for you. It is body denying.
System, in fact.
Yeah. And it used to be a aspirational to hear about like these advanced yogis, quote unquote, who would sit for 21 days and not have food, not need to go to the toilet, not need to drink, not have any sort of earthly desires. And you'd think, wow, that's amazing. And now I think, wow, that's dysfunctional. Like, that's like not normal for a body, right? And so I was starting to have a lot of different physical issues from yoga, like, it's very common for women to lose their period. It's very common for people to develop different body dysmorphic syndromes or disorders. It's very common.
It's interesting because that isn't talked about. It's interesting you say it's very common because I know so many people in the yoga world. I myself had, not for very long, but I had a pretty good Ashtanga yoga practice myself for a bit till I became a dad and then began to self-medicate with beer, and that went out the window. But you never heard any of the yoginis or any of these people saying, "Oh, I lost my period," or that. If they were, they were certainly keeping it to themselves.
I was teaching in the upper echelons of it at one point, and I'm watching people who are writing for Yoga Journal, and I'm watching people who are like on Gaia, and I'm watching people that are like, really at the top of the profession there. And I know them personally, and I know that their reality is different from what they're teaching.
Okay.
Like, and I'm like, this is just not right. Like, something is really not right here. And so for me, what I understand now about many of the practices is that they take people into collapse, which is the point, right? Like, you're supposed to be at the end of your nervous system when you pass over. But the collapse feels better to a lot of people, because now sensation is absent in the body, which feels safer. Most people equate any sort of feeling or sensation in the body with a degree of danger. You feel more in control because now your conscious brain and your unconscious brain are more in alignment because, again, you're not at war with your body. And so you feel like you have a semblance of control. And that's kind of the two things that are most stand out. And you do lose like a desire because your body's just not in the place where it's robust enough to have it.
So is that the euphoria in collapse? This is interesting. Would that be,
Yeah,
for
in the later
example,
stages of collapse. So like motor neurone disease, MS, a lot of those things are like the later stages of collapse. And a lot of the studies they've done with people show those people to be very happy because the self-protective mechanism of the body when it is in that advanced stage of nervous system, I don't want to say degradation because that's not the right word, but just of where it's sitting, is to actually like create a degree of euphoria as a hand-holding mechanism, basically.
pump you full of feel-good
Yes.
hormones to take you
Yeah.
into a
Yeah.
smooth transition?
Yeah.
Is that
And
is
for me
that
as well,
is
like
that the calm that a wildebeest has? You know, when they're looking at the
yes,
wild dogs pulling their
exactly.
guts out,
They've
and you see
gone
them
and they have
looking
the lovely
benignly,
thoughts and the hallucinations and
and they're
the
not
yeah.
feeling that, okay, maybe
Yeah.
DMT being produced in the pineal gland,
Yeah. Well,
all
like
of that.
the thing about
Okay,
the nervous system is it is designed to lead you in the best way possible towards death. Like if you think
right.
about it
I
from that
can see
perspective,
that. I see what you're
which is
saying. Like the
but
body's
it's
trying to
only
work
supposed
for you, right?
yeah, but it's only
Okay,
supposed to happen at like 6 weeks, right when you're old. But now we're stuck in like 40 years in the collapse stage, you know, for some people. And so there's this wear and tear that happens. But
okay.
yeah, and you know, for me with the yoga as well, and I don't know, I think I can speak for a wider audience when I say this, in that like aside from the body denial, that idea of like oneness with consciousness is also somewhat of a relief for a lot of people who have, you know, cultural expectations and sometimes not great experiences around sex and relationship and intimacy. And so it's a ticket out of that, right? Like
If it takes
it's
you
a
away from the
ticket.
body and
Yeah,
mentally
it's
away
a
from
ticket out of that
relationships.
to think, okay, well, I just don't even have to deal with that now. I can be like, I can just be little old me merging with the universal consciousness, and I get to deny everything that feels uncomfortable in my body. I get to deny everything that feels uncomfortable emotionally. I get to deny, and just move towards this. And because actually being in a body affirming, life affirming practice is freaking hard, right?
Right.
Because then you have to be in life, and life is
Right,
hard
right, right. I
sometimes.
get
So
it. I get it. So if you're,
it
but if
can
you're a
be,
mum, you know, dealing with your kid, you haven't got that option, right? You got to get up. You got to deal with your kids. You got to have these relationships. You got to deal
yeah.
with life
Well,
with the sensory system, with other people's sensory systems.
the Mohans would say that this is not a practice for family aged people
Okay.
because you have responsibilities. This is the practice for when you get to be, you know, older.
So if you are a mum or a dad going through what mums and dads go through, then, and you are firmly stuck in
Then the asana part of the yoga
yeah,
journey is your emphasis at that point, the posture
okay.
part. But it becomes less and less about posture. And then it becomes more and more about emergence with the divine and
Right.
one point of focus.
But with your work, then, if I'm me, dad, I'm dad, you know, dealing with dad stuff. I'll be up early tomorrow morning dealing with dad stuff. There is no choice but to deal with relationships. There is no choice but to
Yes. Yeah.
then delving into my nervous system can help me to respond appropriately to what's in front of me.
Yeah, absolutely. It just
Okay.
depends
Will
what
give
you
me
want.
tools. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just about like, now I have the capacity to show up and meet what I need to show up for in a way that's real.
Okay.
And some people will opt out of that, by the way. Yeah. Some people will opt out of that because it brings a degree of discomfort to be able to meet what's real. Sometimes you recognize your situation needs to change, or your relationship needs to change, or you're not actually doing something that fulfills you, or this wasn't the choice that you would have liked to have made. And so you have to meet that. You have to meet that. And that takes resilience, that takes courage, that takes, you know, a lot of what we're fed in the world at the moment.
No, I'm going to go into a cave and just meditate. Thanks very much, Jane.
Really?
Yeah.
But really, you can see that's an attractive option,
Yeah,
right? Like meeting the
absolutely.
reality is not necessarily an attractive option, but I decided that like I would rather meet the reality in the full discomfort than be in the delusion. So,
And was it in that meeting of the reality, would you say, that your pain began to dissipate?
yeah, so the the way the body leverages movement is different from sympathetic, so different from the fight flight system to the parasympathetic. So when I'm looking to create movement in the fight flight system, it's my lower back and my neck that leverage the movement. The lower back is what is fueling movement in the lower part of the body, and the neck fuels the movement of the shoulder girdle, so moving in and out of the tube. And I think one of the missing pieces of information out there is that I've just lost my train of thought, is that when we think about movement patterns, your movement is either rooted in your sympathetic nervous system or it's rooted in your parasympathetic nervous system. And so the movement patterns themselves are the way that your body creates movement is basically a product of where your nervous system is sitting. And so for me, I was stuck in a dominant mode of functioning, if you think about it like that, like a dominantly sympathetic or fight flight mode of functioning. And the way that my body was achieving everyday activities like walking around, going up and down steps, like getting up and down off the couch, was a fight flight action. The dominant mode of functioning was fight flight. And so even if my emotional framework didn't warrant a fight flight response, the way that my movement was dominantly geared was in the fight flight system. So I was just firing off my nervous system every time I moved around. So overall, because my lumbar spine is working so hard and my cervical spine is working so hard from such an early age, and we tend to be gifted the nervous system of our mothers and our primary caregivers, I was just creating so much compression and leverage in my body that it was resulting in chronic pain. And so when I changed the underlying nervous system state and changed the way that my body was leveraging movement, I don't get the pain anymore.
Was that the aha moment? Like, at what point did you realize, oh my gosh, this is happening?
I instantly changed. So when I had a couple of questions answered that I hadn't had answered for a long time, I was like, shit. Basically, that was my best response, because it's like I've built this body of work on all of this study I've done over the last 20 years. And now I'm sitting here on a Zoom call realizing that actually I've got some stuff wrong. And so I am going to completely redo my program from the ground up. And that's what I did. And I told people, I was like, so, you know how you've been working with me for like a really long time and we've been doing this stuff.
Oh, really? You had to go to, by now you've got the online memberships and all that. You had to go back and say, oh, by the way, that was all bollocks. That was all shite. Now we have to.
Yeah.
Wow, that's brave.
I didn't think it was all shite, but I was like, I've got some questions. I've got some answers here to holes that have been in the program, and we're going to take it from the ground up and I'm going to change it. So you've got 6 months to go through what I've got here. And in 6 months' time, we're wiping it and starting again.
Was it when you went through that kind of reboot? So you by this time, you've actually established a successful online business, which presumably is getting results and helping people. Otherwise, people
wouldn't. Yes, it is.
Right.
It is.
So did you have some confusion from people saying, well, hold on, Jane, it's actually working for me. Why do I need to do this other stuff?
Yeah, there are definitely people that were a little cross with me. Not many. I think that I guess, I don't know, maybe people just didn't tell me. That's another thing. The people that talked to me were very nice. But I guess one of the things that I have.
How long ago was this? Would you say that you said, okay?
So probably 2 or 3 years ago that I really changed the whole foundation. Okay. Yeah, quite recently. Yeah. And I took people, I gave people a chance. Of course, they didn't have to stay with me. And it was quite scary because,
I bet.
You know, I'm the breadwinner and I've created this successful thing. And now it's just so intolerable to me to not be in alignment with what I teach. I just once I knew something different and I was practicing something different, I'm like, I can't teach people any different to what I'm doing. Like that's just so there was no decision. Like it was.
I guess you were inviting them to go along with the evolution, but nonetheless, that is a brave step. Not everybody would, as you said.
Yeah.
You know, some of the yoga people perhaps that you met were walking one talk and walking one walk.
And some things that I teach now are a complete 180 from what I was doing before.
Okay.
And so, but I can say why. And I think one of the advantages maybe that I have within my membership is that if this is an advantage or not, I've always been really honest. Like I I really see myself as adventuring with this group of incredible people, and I don't discount their opinion or their thoughts, or it's not like my way or the highway. It's just like, this is information, right? And one of the things that I've really learned about teaching, and I attempt to practice in life with varying degrees of success, is that in order to be honest, you have to be willing to lose. So I was willing for everyone to leave me. I had to be willing for everyone to leave me in order to be able to present something new, because if I wasn't willing for people to leave, I wouldn't have done it. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to lay it all on the table. And I don't think hardly anyone left. And then it took a while. There was a transition, but I'd already been practicing for a good period of time before I started teaching it, because of course and that was a really annoying part of the practice as well, because coming from someone who's like, okay, give me the book, give me all the shit. I'm going to sit down for a weekend, and by Monday I'm going to have this nailed, and then I'll teach it. It wasn't something that I could think my way through. This was an unconscious, I had to have a resonance in my body and understanding in my body of the process before I could teach it. And so that required some practice on my part. And then I just said, right, okay, July, we're changing. You've got this amount of time. And I started to cross-pollinate conversations. So to bring in the material in conversation before we taught it. And then it took a while for people to get into. And yeah.
So back to where we began, which is what this whole podcast is about, which is about self-actualization and people led self-actualized lives, and are leading self-actualized lives. From the outside, observing you appear to be self-actualizing. What I mean by that is you began with a problem to fix and a quest to go on, some of it unconscious, some of it conscious. And then there were multiple reboots where every time, this is just sort of observing the story from the outside, every time you had sort of achieved a certain thing in a certain area, whether it was being the good girl at school, whether it was the human rights work, whether it was getting a mastery of this certain aspect of yoga, and then saying, actually, no, it's this aspect of yoga. And then saying, no, actually, I'm going back. I'm going to work in retail, but I'm going to write, and I'm going to build that.
What a confused individual.
And meanwhile, I'm going to keep this writing thing going parallel. I've achieved a certain mastery at sort of showing as a teen and young adult, but now moving away from that, I'm going to move into this other aspect of horsemanship. You haven't really touched on that much, but I'd like to come back and do that in the next podcast. What emerges is a picture of growth, where it's almost like you see, from seedling to sapling to, I'm not suggesting that you're a big, mature, wide tree, but you know what I mean? But a mighty oak. But this maturing process, and it brings into my mind is self-actualization. In fact, to a large degree, maturing, and not maturing mean, you use growing up. God forbid any of us ever do that. And I wonder if the mighty oak, considers itself to be grown up, or it says, actually, I still want to be a big grown up tree one day, even though I'm now 100 foot tall. And, is that what goes through trees' minds? But it's really interesting to see, I'd like to come back I think that a lot of listeners will have questions like, well, how did you build the business? And how did you, what is the secret of success for an online thing? And I'd like to invite people to send those questions, and we'll have Jane back.
Gifting your spleen to the universe.
That's right. And Jane will explain these things to you, and we will have another podcast in which you will send these very natural questions, and Jane will tell you how to make billions on the internet. But that's not what you set out to do. That's the interesting thing to me. You didn't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to become this super successful online business showing people how to get back to their nervous systems in a way that's going to improve their lives. It evolved out of a desire to share and write about that which you knew to be helpful. And then from there, you learned some online business skills, which again, yes, I think we should have you back, and it would be great to hear how you did that, because I think it's useful for a lot of people. But nonetheless, that doesn't seem to be the primary motivation. It seems that the primary motivation was simply the acquisition and sharing of this knowledge. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, totally. I just had an energy to do that.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a seeking energy as well. Like I talk about intellectual energy. I don't know if that's the right word, but like I love to be considering and seeking and finding information and sharing information. For me, that was like a very rewarding process. It was to do that and to share and to find people finding that useful. And like I said, it was a couple of years before I even considered that was anything financially viable in that. I mean, that was kind of a shock to even consider that someone would find me useful in a way that they would actually want to pay me. And that wasn't like a thought in the beginning. And then, the second thing out of that, just from a business perspective, because I kind of, well, without downplaying other people's experiences, I sort of chuckle to myself sometimes when people will email me and they're like, I've been doing this thing for 3 months now and I haven't made money. I was like, I worked for 5 years without making any money. Like, it's like without even, it's just, this kind of, I think the internet breeds like an instant idea of being able to financially translate something into dollars, And so not to say that that's going to be other people's experience, but just it is sort of difficult to put I've forgotten the question that you asked me. I feel like
it's about self-actualization, and so what comes to mind. Maybe I'll pose this question slightly differently. Would you say that actually one of the keys to self-actualization is putting what you do in service?
Yeah, and just being unemployable. I think I'm completely unemployable. Like the idea of working for someone else is so unacceptable to me that like I really loathe, and I mean this, I really loathe having my schedule dictated by someone else. Like the thought of having to get up and go, I actually can't think of anything worse. Like I love to be able to go, and I work really hard,
actually,
but I decide.
Don't kid yourself, Jane. Your schedule is completely dictated by your kids.
That's true. That's true.
They are your bosses, but yeah.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I've struggled so much.
I know the feeling.
Yeah.
But it seems to me too that that's been the other long, concurrent, thread through the story, is that there's been an element of service at each step.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And that without that, I wonder if one can self-actualize, because without that, it's interesting. Like, is somebody who makes an awful lot of money, but without an element of service, without an element of sharing, without an element, is that self-actualization? That's a question for the listeners. I wonder, but it seems to me that the, fulfillment must come with a feeling of satisfaction that you can't just get from dopamine of, I got these zeros in my bank account. It's got to come from something richer.
Well, I think my work, everything about my work is it's reciprocal in nature. Mm-hmm. Like I benefit in the best possible way from my work. I benefit from it not only in knowledge, but I get to share that knowledge, which if anyone has ever taught anything, that you really have to know something to teach it, because that starts to show up what you don't know when you start to explain it to someone else. So there's I've always launched myself into sharing knowledge, which has forced me to really understand what it is that I'm sharing, because that process of learn, do, teach, I activate very quickly. But beyond that, I have an incredible community of people that I work with, and I include my horses within that, and they save me many times. They save me. On tough days or hard days that we all have, I still show up and I feel different after I've taught than I do at the beginning. And that's because it's not just me, right? Like it's an energetic exchange, and I feel equally valued, and hopefully they feel valued and loved and appreciated and respected as part of the process as well. And I think that that's, that kind of experience is not something that you would ever gain by just selling a product. For me, it's, there's a couple of questions that I get asked, which is like, how do I get to do what you're doing? And I'm like, I've got no idea, because so much of what I'm doing has been informed by my life experience. It's not so much just about like, sure, you can learn these things, you can study with these people and you can do that, but it's not quite just that. So I don't know, you have to do you, which is like the, a bit of a hard statement to say, but as well, there's also a idea of passive income and of like floating off on the island and that sort of thing. And on the one hand, some days that sounds very, very appealing, but actually ultimately when it comes down to it, I'm not really interested in just like the success in whatever way that has manifested. I believe comes through the connection.
Having seen your Joyride community in action, I was lucky enough to meet some of them. I can definitely attest to that. It seems an unusually mutually supportive
They're
group.
incredible.
Like it's not like, someone going online to do multi-level marketing or something like that. Not there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but why you're getting into that. I want to go in, I want to sell these products in order to make money, so I get free. But really what people are saying, I feel when they're going into it is, yes, I want to be free. I feel that the money will make me free. You have achieved that freedom, and to a large degree that is also financial. Money does give one these choices. Obviously you didn't start there, but I do wonder if those who are trying to go into an online business like yours with the idea of making money as the primary goal, even if they were to achieve that, would they feel self-actualized? Would they feel?
I wonder if that's enough for what it takes. For the longevity, I wonder if that's enough, because it's a lot of work. Not to say that people are work shy. It's definitely a lot of work. Like I work a lot. And
so you're doing live sessions with people all the time on
all the time, and then making content. On the daily, for the most part, and then
hours, right?
Yeah, there's lots of other things that come into it, but I mean, maybe it's enough. Maybe it's enough to keep going. But for me, I mean, I don't even know how much money I earn. I've got no idea. I mean, I don't mean that to sound like I don't even know how much money I earn. Like I have enough to like, but I don't look at the.
Yeah.
I don't. It's not.
You're keeping score.
No, and I guess that's a privilege, because there must be enough coming in to not have to keep score, to know that I can pay the bills each month, which is a thing. But yeah, it's not like, oh, like it's just like I would keep doing it even if 10 people, 5 people, I don't know what else I would do. Like if someone said to me, and occasionally you get used to this question, like, what would you do if you won the lottery? It's like, well, actually I'd be doing the same thing. I would be doing the same thing. I'd probably have an indoor arena. And there would be a few tweaks, but as far as like where my life energy is being invested, I would be doing the same thing, just with like a really, really freaking nice saddle or something else like that. But like I'm not going to deny things, but yeah.
But you're doing that which you love.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I mean, we're at 2.5 hours here, and there's more that we could go into. And I think, so one of the things that I promised the Livery Library listeners is that we then will have each person back to answer the question.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Well, throw in. So would you consent to come back? And
absolutely.
Yeah. So let's send in your questions to Jane. She's a wealth of knowledge. It can be on the how did you do it? It can be on the what do you do? It could be on the tell me more about that parasympathetic and sympathetic. They tell me more about those body maps. Jane turned me onto a book. Is it The Body Has a Mind of Its Own? Yes. Yeah. About body maps and brain maps, which even though I thought I knew quite a lot about the nervous system, I realized I didn't. And it was fascinating. And there's much, much, much more to learn. And I think next time we come back, Jane, I want to talk to you in more detail about that, because now we've sort of had your story. I'd like to go into more depth about this.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions on anything. Like, there's really no hold
because it's
bar.
helpful. I think a lot of us walk around in a state of anxiety and we don't even know why. I think that that's one of the symptoms of the modern age. Hold on, my life's good. I've got a nice job. I've got enough to eat. Blah blah blah. Why do I feel so shit?
Yeah.
And I think that this is a question at the heart of our societal experience at the moment. We've never had it so good, really, as a species, and yet we seem to have never been quite so unhappy.
Yeah.
Why
And I
is
think
that?
as well, like, one of the platforms that's not as openly or often discussed, and this, I doubt it goes outside what you want to talk about here, but maybe it does, but I'll throw it in here and we can always talk about it somewhere else as well, is just like that, you and me have done those vitality workshops together as well, and like discussed what that means or what that looks like to live in a vital way. And to me, the essence of what I was attempting to escape from, I think, with a lot of the yoga practices, just me personally, like, again, I don't want to paint a brush, but like, is really common for people's experiences, like the struggles that we have with like ourselves, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to others, our relationship to intimacy, our relationship to sexual expression, our relationship to passion, all of those things, like, really,
Or the difficult.
we separate them. Yeah, we separate them, but they're not separate. And yet it's still kind of a little bit taboo when we talk about these types of conversations, or just not as openly discussed or talked about. And so that's really interesting to me as well. I mean, I get lots of, it's not quite the right word. I have the honor of working with a lot of women in my program that are in their 70s or in their 60s, and they got married very young. And it's like they have one foot in a time where women's rights and expectations were very different, and another foot in this modern era where they recognize and see all of these different opportunities around them. And perhaps they've changed and their husband hasn't, or like, and how to negotiate that, when we talk about self-actualization. And I feel like there's a lot of people in this like transition point, both in time and both physiologically and both mentally and emotionally, that means that they're kind of a little bit at war with themselves. And
that feeling of sort of inner schizophrenia almost.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting point. I just wanted to throw that in there alongside the nervous system stuff and alongside the other stuff, because it's interesting.
Well, listeners, if you got that, you've got that inner conflict, send us in the questions. What do I do about it? Please, Jane will sort you out. Tell us how people can contact you and where they can find you.
Well, you can send love. You can just sit there and send really good vibes all the way through, and it'll be happily received. But if you do want to directly contact me, you can jump on my website. confidentwriter.online is the best place to find me. And I'm on the socials as well, or you can email me, jane@confidentwriter.online. And
jane@confidentwriter.online.
Yeah, and I will merrily reply. Yeah, give me a few days. Sometimes I'm a little behind on emails, but it's not personal. Yeah, so that would be amazing to hear from people.
Okay. Well, then I can't wait till we can have you back. Jane, thanks so much for
That's a pleasure.
gracing us with your story and your wisdom. For those of you who want to hear more, we'll be having Jane back to hear our other podcast on equine assisted interventions, equine assisted world. Go to us at longridehome.com. And if you're interested in the work we do with autism, the brain, and all the other stuff, ls.co, newtrailslearningsystems.co. Send your questions to Jane, but do bother with me to send the questions so that I can ask them of Jane. So please send the questions. Say, I've got these questions for Jane. How'd you do it? Blah, blah, blah. And then we can have her back and she can tell us. All right, Jane, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join our website, newtrailslearning.com to check out our online courses and live workshops in Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Athena. These evidence-based programs have helped children, veterans, and people dealing with trauma around the world. We also offer a horse training program and self-care program for riders on longridehome.com. These include easy-to-do online courses and tutorials that bring you and your horse joy. For an overview of all shows and programs, go to rupertisaacson.com. See you on the next show. And please remember to press subscribe and share.